Good morning. I marvel at people that can read their phone without glasses on. Thus says the Lord. How would you describe God if you were asked to do so? What maybe specific attribute or attributes would you point to if someone asked you what your experience with God was? Maybe, like me, you've lived a few years, which is why you need glasses to read your phone. And you've seen all the just many ways that God has guided you and directed you, say through your career or through house purchases or your finances or decisions through relationships. And you look back at all these years where God was literally kind of almost dragging his finger through the dirt before you like a meandering river that you could walk right through. And in this, you would speak of God's great wisdom compared to yours. Or maybe you would think of an incredibly difficult time in your life, maybe a loss, maybe a tragedy or a shattered dream. And in that, you would speak of God's infinite presence or his infinite mercy and kindness. I always remember Shannon when she lost Dave. Ever since then, she has described Jesus as her husband, and I always marvel at that because I know she understands something at a deeper level about God than I probably will until I see him face to face. Or maybe like me when I'm in the backcountry on a hunt, or surfing, or on a mountain bike, or on a hike, and in that moment, you witness and see the massive creativity and the beauty and the insane power that God can wield in creation. If you were asked, when you leave here today, how would you describe God? What attribute or attributes would stick in your mind the most? I think we kind of get God at an individual attribute level. We have notions maybe of what it means to say that God is loving, or God is wise, or God is powerful. But there is a level of God, a grasping of God that seems to elude us and me. And we've touched on it a bit the last couple of months, and Jerry camped on it a bit a couple weeks ago in this beautiful explanation. It's the idea or the concept of God's glory. The idea of glory to me feels so vague. Tim Brady prayed. We have a group of people that pray before the service, and he prayed that you would all see God's glory this morning. And even though I'm preaching on this morning, I thought, what is that? Jerry described people's explanation of his glory as often nothing more than a word salad, which is classic. It's such a popular, oft-heard statement, the glory of God. But I dare to guess that most of us have a very hazy concept of what the glory of God is. We can say, that's God's love. Or we can say, that's clearly God's leading. Or that was God's healing, or that was God's wisdom, or that was God's kindness, or a display of his might. But where is that's clearly God's glory? And yet glory is the theme of these huge 5 chapters in the Gospel of John that we're going through between chapters 13 and 17. What is God's glory? How do we know if we have seen it? How do we describe it to both ourselves and to somebody else? Jerry helped us a bit in his message a few weeks ago when he described that scene. You remember this in Exodus where Moses climbs Mount Sinai and he asks God, I want to see your glory. Do you remember this story? And God says, okay, go back into the cleft of the rock, kind of tuck your way in there, and I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll turn my back to you and I'll walk past. And you will, God says, see my glory. And there's 3 words that the scriptures use, that God uses to describe his glory: goodness, compassion, and grace. Well, because this concept of glory is so difficult and also so important because it comes up so often, and Finally, it's the theme of one of the most significant sections in all of Scripture, John chapter 3, verse 17. We need to look at it from a bunch of angles and probably a bunch of messages before we kind of begin to understand it. The way this section plays out, that we're going to be in for several months, John 13 through 17. John 13 is kind of these deeply symbolic actions. Jeremy preached a couple weeks ago on where Jesus washes their feet. Or you might remember before where Mary anoints Jesus for his death. Or we have the Lord's Supper, or we have this betrayal by Judas. And then in chapters 14 through 16, we have these high intensity, I'm almost ready to die teachings, like the last words of Jesus. And then the coup de grace, if you will, is John 17, which is the high priestly prayer of Jesus before his Father, right before he suffers and dies. And it all resounds with this idea of God's glory. And to emphasize it this morning, in the first two verses of our section, of our passage, Jesus uses the word glory no less than 5 times. John 13:31. When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once." Talking about a word salad. That is one if I've ever read one. The glory of God. And by the way, this is only the second time in the entire Gospel of John Jesus has talked about himself receiving glory. Normally when Jesus talks about glory, he talks about him wanting to glorify his Father. But now he says, no, it's time for the Son of Man to be glorified. But as he said earlier, if you see me, you've seen the Father. If I get glorified, so does he, and vice versa. So how do we tackle this at a different layer and from many different angles, this idea of the glory of God? I want to try to wrestle with and answer 3 questions together. First of all, what is the definition of glory? And I realize when I type that out, it's a little arrogant because I don't know that there is the definition. So really, what is a definition? A helpful definition of his glory. And then once we know what that is, where do we go to find it? What's the main picture that we have of glory? How do we best see God's glory? And then finally, once we see it, what's our appropriate response? How should we react? So let's first of all try to find a definition for glory. And let's set the stage real quickly. The passage starts when it says, when he had gone out, then Jesus said. When he had gone out. Who had gone out is the question. Judas, one of the 12, Judas Iscariot, had just left the room to betray Jesus. Jesus picks just this crazy moment for this teaching, right? He chooses to define him and his Father's glory, God's glory, in the moment when one of his closest compatriots, one of his 12 chosen disciples, is going to stab him in the back. I'll let you just sit that in the back of your head and keep reminding yourself of that as we go through this. So, the glory of God. Once again, what is it very quickly? I've said this so many times when I preach that we should think of God's glory simply as his reality. So let me see if I can illustrate this. A few weeks ago, Lynn and I were invited to go to the Grassi's house for dinner. I don't think the Grassi's I know are not here this morning, so this is even better, by the way, because we can be shameless. We would be shameless if Jerry Grassi was here. How many of you know Jerry Grassi? Raise your hand high. A lot of you know Jerry Grassi. He's my hot-blooded Italian friend. He's one of the elders here. I get to Jerry. He says, here's the deal. I want Linda to come around 6. I want you to come around 4, and we're going to cook together. So I get there, and there's drying stands on the counter. He's got an apron on. There's flour all over him. There's food all over the counter, and Jerry and I, for 2 hours, made pasta together. Now, if I say to you this phrase, when I walked in that room, there was Grassi wine. He didn't make it, by the way. There was grassy flour, not from his own family. It was a narcissistic, beautiful dinner. When I say to you, it was Jerry in all his glory, what would you respond to that? Throw it out to me, church. What words would you use to say, to describe when I say to you, it was Jerry in all of his glory? Italian. Cooking. Enjoyment. Cocktails, yes. Laughter, what? Gluttony, absolutely. I could barely roll my way home. He had polenta baked cornmeal cups filled with sausage in a red sauce and then baked with Parmesan cheese over the top just to nourish us while we made pasta. He's a passion freak. He's a nut. And you know what else he is? He's loud. Jerry is the loudest person I know. He's in Seinfeld. He's not a soft talker. In fact, sometimes when you're out with him, you get a little embarrassed because he's so boisterous. It was Jerry in all of his glory. Glory is the beauty beyond bearing of all of God's attributes. You see, glory is actually the sum of God's attributes. Glory is the sum of all of his greatness, which is why it is so difficult to get your arms around. Again, I get God is loving at some level. I get God is merciful at some level. I get God is a gentleman, not overstepping his bounds with me. I get that at some level. But all of his attributes, all at once, how do you take that in? I remember in Matthew 13, there's that parable of the guy that discovers the treasure in the field. You remember? He goes and runs, and it says, with joy, he sells everything he has to pay for this field so he can own this treasure. With joy, suddenly he is not so attached to his possessions because something is so moving. There's something so beyond what he has ever seen or found. Greater value, greater glory, the sum of him. The Greek word is doxa or doxazo. It's where we get the word doxology from. Sometimes it means ultimate value, ultimate worth, glorious, brilliant, beauty. It is not one thing. It is all things all at once. The glory of God is the sum of who he is. That's why, again, in that scene that Jerry described in Exodus with God, while passing by Moses, Moses is only allowed to see the backside of God. Because if God displayed himself in full essence, Moses would have died. And yet, this is fascinating to me, just glancing at God's back, in other words, just partially grasping the sum of who God is, made Moses' face shine for days upon days. Have you ever been so gripped by God or the thought of God, maybe a moment, maybe during worship, maybe a song, maybe a movement of God in your life, or a movie or a picture that you simply said, I can't take this in? I've had moments like that just with beauty. I remember the first time we went to the Grand Canyon, and I stood before this canyon, and I had that feeling like, this is incredible, and this is too much for me. I had that the first time an elk stood before me at 50 yards, bugling, my hands shaking. I was so overwhelmed by it. And I thought I was calm. And then the elk walked away because I screwed it up. And about 3 minutes later, my knees started just shattering each other. I was so overwhelmed by the moment. This is what it means to catch a glimpse of the backside of the sum of who God is. We were in elk camp once, Jeff Clipness and I, and his nephew Shane, who's a very, very close brother of mine. Eric Sutherland was there, and I can't remember if my son Scott was there. And we'd finished the hunt. We were sitting around the fire, and we just were sharing like we always do and eating food and having a good glass of wine. And we had some music on in the background, and we prayed a little bit, and then Jeff just fell apart. He was just sobbing uncontrollably. And it wasn't anything in particular, by the way. It was everything all at once. He could barely speak. He was so moved by the thought of the sum of who God is. There's literally nothing more beautifully overwhelming than being drenched in the sum of who God is. Even partially, even if it is our limited backside version, if you will. Remember in Isaiah 6, which I covered a few weeks ago, Isaiah enters the throne room of God, and he sees God in all God's sum. And what does he say? Do you remember? Woe is me, I am, say it louder. I am undone. I am ruined is what the Hebrew word means. That to me doesn't sound good, but it was great because just a couple verses later, God touches his mouth and he begs God to be his mouthpiece to one of the most obstinate people in the history of mankind. So if this is the ultimate, to be wrecked perfectly, to see the sum of who God is in all his compassion and grace and mercy, then where do we find it? What is the best place to go to see the glory of God? Is there a singular spot I can go to in my life that I can see the sum of who God is? How do we stand at the cleft of the rock like Moses did to see the sum of his parts? How do we enter the throne room of God like Isaiah did, to be ruined in the best way by God's overwhelming glory? Where will his glory be manifest best and most obviously? John 13:31. When Judas had gone out, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him at once." Notice what the text says. It's really pointed. Now it will be manifested. At once, Jesus says. So this is really odd to me. Jesus is literally saying, okay, if you want to see my glory, if you want to see the sum of who I am, if you want to see the glory of the Father, the sum of who he is, if you want to see the sum of God, the glory of God, as Moses and Isaiah did, now, he says, now you will see it. This is weird. He doesn't say, I'm going to make water into wine. Now you're going to see my glory. He doesn't say, now I'm going to touch a guy and who's been born blind and nobody's ever healed a blind man born blind. Now you're going to see my glory. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say, now I'm going to have this guy who's been laying on a mat by the pool of Bethesda for 38 years. Now I'm going to get him to walk around and dance a jig, and you're going to look at me and you're going to know the glory of God. You're going to see the sum of who I am. Doesn't say that. Shockingly. Now I'm going to raise Lazarus from the dead. Now you'll see the sum of who I am. Doesn't say that. Notice not eventually, which I would think, when I resurrect, which is the penultimate movement of God, when Jesus walks on the neck of darkness for us. Notice not when Jesus ascends to the Father and retakes his throne. The prophet Daniel, hundreds of years earlier, spoke of the Ancient of Days, Jesus, ascending on a cloud to be seated next to God the Father. And yet Jesus doesn't say, you will see my glory when I once again take the throne. Jesus doesn't point to the end of Revelation when he literally makes every single thing that's wrong right again. But rather now, the greatest manifestation of God's glory will be seen. And where does he say it will be seen? At the cross. The cross is the sum of who God is. The moment when God's greatness is summed up is what? Jesus says it's the cross. The disciples were totally lost. Kind of the same way we are when we hear glory. But you and I have never seen him more clearly than this, which is so weird. It doesn't make any sense. This was absolute public humiliation. The creator of the universe, Jesus, is the member within the Trinity that breathed you and I and everything we know and see into existence. And he is stripped naked before all of humanity. This was deeply traumatic suffering. Isaiah, the great prophet, said his face was beaten beyond recognition. His own mother looked on him and did not know who he was. This was totally unjust. Rather than having angels on either side of him, floating above him in worship, he has a common thief on either side. If you saw him there in that moment, you would be physically ill. If you really saw what he looked like, which, by the way, no movie, no picture has ever shown, you would be forced unconsciously to turn the other way. You would not be able to look upon him. This is the exact opposite. This is the exact opposite of how we would think of his glory, at least me. Now the Son of Man is glorified and the Father with him. The Isaiah throne picture, I get that. The Moses in the cleft of the rock and God passing by him in grandeur on Sinai, I get that one. But Jesus says, if you want to try and take me all in, if you want to try and take us, the Trinity, in, Father, Son, and Spirit, all in, look at the cross. Now the Son of Man is glorified and the Father with him. The cross is the sum of who he is. The cross allows us to sum up who he really is, how he thinks, how he feels, what he will do, what he will endure. And it's weird. I thought about this a lot when I studied for this. This was such a mind-boggling thing. I kept seeing that word now, and I kept thinking, wasn't there another time? Wasn't there another time? For heaven's sake, you made everything. Wouldn't you stand before the precipice of a creation and say, now I can see the Son of God? No. Now at the cross, you will see the sum of who I am. So I sat there, and as I was studying, I thought, is this true? Is this really, does the cross sum up every attribute of God in a single moment? And it does. It is the greatest display of what real power is. Only someone that is willing to lay his rights down and his freedom down in weakness is really powerful and strong. It is the greatest display of his love. What does John say in chapter 15? Greater love has no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends. And by the way, you are my friends. It is the greatest display of his vast, limitless wisdom. Only God knew that to go up means you have to go down. Only God knew opposite George kingdom thinking that we talk about all the time here and acting would win over darkness when nobody else would do it. Nobody but Jesus. It is the greatest display of his holiness. The cross is perfect, pure devotion to the Trinity's desire above his own. It is the greatest display of patience. What does he say to Judas? Do what you do quickly. Or when Jesus hangs on the cross, what does he say? Father, forgive them. They have no idea what they're doing. Or before Caiaphas, with all of this rankling going on against him, it says Jesus remains silent. It is the greatest display of his courage, of his settled nature, of his steadiness. Jesus said to him, to Pilate, you have said so, but I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. It is the greatest display of his self-control and his forbearance and his endurance as he stood before Pilate, telling him plainly, buddy, the only reason you have authority is because my Father gave it to you. Don't get too full of yourself. It is the greatest display of his mercy. What does he say to the thief next to him? Today, brother, today you will be with me in paradise. His mother is standing before him at the cross. He's mutilated. John, the writer of our gospel, stands next to him. He's probably 15, 16 years old. And Jesus looks at John and says, John, behold your mother. That's not his mother. Jesus is saying, yeah, it is now. I want you to take care of her. And oh, by the way, Mom, behold, that's your son. It is the greatest display of his graciousness. Being beaten in that courtyard, Peter doesn't just deny him. You know what the text says? Peter cursed him. It's way beyond. And it is, oh my gosh, the greatest display of humility the world has ever seen. Only someone willing to see his glory set aside is glorious. This is the glory of the cross. This is what he's asking you and I to take in. Believe it or not, every day. Every day. As Jerry said, to grasp this, we have to walk into the light. We don't stand in the light. We make a movement towards the light. We walk to the foot of the cross in our hearts and our minds every day. So I thought, maybe we should try this. I was looking for that verse where it says, woe to me, I'm ruined. And I'm like, you idiot, you just taught on this like 3 days ago and you don't remember this is Isaiah 6? I'm not a bright man. But instead of pulling up Isaiah 6, it pulled up a song. So of course I clicked because it wasn't a kitty. And this YouTube song came in that just floored me. I just sat there and cried. So I thought, why don't we just pause? Why don't we just take 2 minutes and take the sum of who Jesus is at the cross?
Darkness, when I'm looking for a sign, when I'm feeling like I can't go on, you're closing all the sides. You are stronger than my doubt. Your love finds me when I hide, and even when I try to live, when I am, you are always kind, and I am undone. I am undone. When you cried on the garden, let your will be done, not mine. When you took the weight of my mistakes, so I don't have to fight it. Now
What a strange God. Amen? So what does Jesus say is the response to his glory? When we have those moments, when we try and take in the sum of who God is, what does Jesus say? Well, he goes on to finish this passage, and when you read it, it looks like he's changing the subject, but he's really not. He says this, little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and just as I said to the Jews, so now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. Now, a new commandment, though, I give you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. I just want to close with two phrases that Jesus gives. They're so powerful. Just as you also. Just as you also. Just as I have, he says. Just as I have loved you, you also. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. Just as. There's the emphasis. There's where it all starts. Just as. See, the key to love, and boy, if you're not new here, I can't imagine you don't know the answer to this. The key to love is to first be loved. If you don't get the just as, you will never get the you also. In 1 John, he says this, in this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we love, he went on to say, because he first loved us. We love because he first loved us, just as. And by the way, this doesn't mean to be fully loved by, say, your spouse or your kids or your parents or your friends. That's like an extra shot in the arm, and you're blessed if you get it. But rather by the only one that can touch your very soul, the one that generated you, designed you, created you, your father and your brother and your life spirit. Just as we are supposed to take this in daily, to feel it so deeply that you also. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. This is, as Jesus says, the true mark that you grasp the Son of God, the cross. And Jesus says something so weird in this passage. He says, it's a new commandment I give you. And I'm like, dude, that ain't a new commandment. You've been saying this for millennia, to love one another. Moses said it in the second book of the Old Testament. So the question is, what is new about this commandment? What is new is the model. As I have loved you. See, no one had ever seen this. No one had ever said this. No one had ever done this. This is the sum of who God is, his glory. Taking in the sum of who he is on the cross daily. With that daily in mind, we love well and we love deeply. We can lose all day long because we've won all eternity long. This is how the world will know my glory and love, Jesus says, which is pretty heady stuff. You see, if the world turns away from Jesus, we should be asking ourselves, am I part of the reason why? And I know that's kind of a harsh comment, but that's actually what Jesus is saying. By this they will know you are my disciples. If what? If we love each other. And I read the numbers all the time, and I'm fascinated by it, that Christianity and the Christian church has been on the decline for a number of years in the West. Not in the rest of the world, just in the West, in Europe and the US, which is really strange because now 4 different institutions have come out and proven that religious affiliation in our country and in the West is actually on the rise. People are actually creating religions and creating affiliations spiritually because they're so desperate for the God they do not know, but not turning to Christianity. And we always blame, and I always blame, kind of the empty pagan atheistic mindset of the world. And there's truth to that. But what Jesus says is, you and I, we will make him known by how we love. We have a massively grave responsibility to make God look accurate, to make him look like he is. And it's everyone, by the way. By this, everyone will know, not just people that don't know Jesus. By the way you love each other, everyone, even followers of Jesus, will go, wow, I'm seeing a side of God I've never seen before. And the only way this will happen is if we take in daily the sum of who he is and his glory. Our life is supposed to reflect the cross. Isn't that interesting? Not just the resurrection, not just the success of the resurrection. We're supposed to take on the cross and the sum of who God is. And the only way that'll happen is if every day, you turn your attention to the cross and in awe say, why me? Let's pray. Jesus, this is why we're here today. We're here because we want to take you in at a clearer, deeper level. We want to look you in the eye on the cross and see the endearing eyes that you look back to us with. We want to let shame fall to the side. We want to let guilt and performance fall to the side. We want to bask in your look, in your glance, and your gaze upon us. Just as. And with the remainder of our time this morning, we want to express to you our appreciation, our gratitude, our limited understanding welling up inside of how kind you have been to each of us. And all God's people said,